"Don't eat that!" The raw shout ripped through the Sunday brunch buzz, and nobody in the Gilded Spoon expected what happened next. The Gilded Spoon was a beacon for the city's elite, nestled like a pearl in a manicured oyster shell of a park. Fountains gurgled nearby, a soothing counterpoint to the city's relentless pulse. It was high noon, and the patio was slammed. Waiters in starched white shirts, masters of balletic balance, navigated the tightrope walk between tables, loaded down with plates piled high with eggs Benedict and steaming mugs of artisanal coffee. The air hung thick with the scent of warm croissants and the sweet perfume of blooming jasmine. But for one guy, none of this registered. At the power table, dead center, sat Richard Sterling. Sterling. The name alone dripped power and old money. He'd carved his empire out of granite, starting with brownstones in his 20s, and rocketing into ventures that made most billionaires look like lemonade stand operators. At 72, he wore confidence like a second skin, the kind that said he didn't just own his world, but maybe yours too. His bespoke suit and gold-rimmed glasses screamed opulence, but as he scanned the menu, his movements were oddly hesitant. Across from him, poised like a cover girl, sat Bianca, his trophy wife, young enough to be his granddaughter. Her raven hair, styled to lethal perfection, framed a face that looked airbrushed in real life. Crimson lipstick, applied with surgeon-like precision, popped against her flawless skin. Every inch of her screamed, high maintenance and don't touch. But the smile plastered on her face didn't quite reach her eyes. She toyed with a diamond tennis bracelet, the ice winking in the sunlight, her attention locked not on her husband, but glued to her iPhone screen. Just beyond the wrought iron patio fence, a kid lingered in the shadows. Small for his 12 years, maybe. His oversized hoodie swallowed his skinny frame whole. Dark eyes, sharp and watchful, darted from table to table, plate to plate, pocket to pocket, hunting for scraps, for an angle. His name was Jax, though nobody in the Gilded Spoon knew it, or cared. His face was just part of the streetscape, a ghost kid with nowhere to be, always on the fringe of conversations, the edge of concern. Richard glanced at his Rolex, the subtle glint of gold catching the light. "You're miles away again," he stated, his voice smooth, but with an edge sharp enough to fillet a fish. Bianca snapped her gaze up, a practiced smile flickering across her lips. "I'm right here, honey," she purred, reaching across the table, her perfectly manicured hand landing on his. "You know how much I adore these little lunches." Jax's stomach let out a rumbling growl that felt like a freight train in his ears. He edged closer to the patio, his footsteps silent as a whisper on the paving stones. He leaned against the railing, the cool metal a stark contrast to the gnawing emptiness in his gut. His eyes locked on Sterling's table. It was a spread, straight, out of a magazine, a food fantasy he hadn't seen up close in months. A pristine white bowl of creamy soup, flanked by a bread basket overflowing with crusty rolls, and a tall glass of sparkling water, beaded with condensation. Then, something shifted. Something that made Jax's street-honed instincts scream danger. As Richard adjusted his glasses and reached for his phone, Bianca's hand, quick as a viper strike, vanished into her designer handbag. Jax saw her fingers close around a small glass vial. She twisted the cap off with a casual flick of her wrist, tilting her hand ever so slightly over the steaming bowl of soup. The clear liquid, invisible in the creamy broth, vanished like smoke. Jax's breath hitched. He froze, eyes wide, watching her stir the soup with her spoon, her expression serene, untouched. Then she leaned in close to Richard, her voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, just loud enough for Jax to catch the chilling words. "After all the crap I've put up with, you are not going to screw this up now." The kid blinked, confusion warring with a sick dread. Was this real? Could a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Vogue ad, sitting in a place that reeked of money, really be doing what he thought she was doing? But the icy tremor in his gut wouldn't let it go. Something was rotten in paradise. Jax's heart slammed against his ribs like a trapped bird. He crouched lower behind the railing, his senses on full alert. He wasn't sure what he'd just witnessed, but the venom in the woman's voice, those cold, clipped words, sent a jolt of ice water through his veins. He clenched his fists, his fingernails digging crescents into his palms. Nobody else had seen, and nobody else was paying attention. It was just him. Another growl from his stomach yanked him back to the harsh reality of hunger, but his eyes remained glued to the power couple at table 12. Richard looked tired, distracted, his spoon hovering over the bowl as he scrolled through his phone. Bianca was back to the perfect wife routine, all charm and practiced smiles, her hand resting delicately on her chin, like she hadn't just whispered something that could freeze hell over. Jax felt the weight of a decision slam into him. His instincts screamed, "Walk away, kid. Not your circus, not your monkeys." Who would believe a street urchin like him? A kid in a threadbare hoodie, standing on the wrong side of the velvet rope, peering into a world that would sooner spit on him than welcome him in? He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat like a golf ball. He glanced around at the other patrons. Laughter, chatter, the clinking of silverware against china. Nobody noticed him. Nobody cared. But his gaze snapped back to Richard's spoon, now dipping into the soup. Jax felt his chest constrict. It wasn't his imagination. He'd seen her. He'd seen her pour something in. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone what was about to happen if the old man took a bite. His thoughts detonated in his brain. He didn't know this guy, this Richard Sterling. Didn't know him a damn thing. But wrong was wrong. The moment stretched, elastic and agonizing. Then, without thinking, without planning, Jax launched himself off the railing and charged straight for the table. His legs felt like lead, heavy and unresponsive, but his feet kept pounding the patio stones. His voice cracked, raw and desperate, as he shouted, "Don't eat that!" Heads whipped around. Conversations died mid-sentence. The clatter of a dropped fork echoed across the suddenly silent patio like a gunshot. Richard froze, his spoon inches from his lips, his eyes widening, locking onto the kid. Bianca spun around, her porcelain mask cracking, revealing the ice beneath. "What did you just say?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to shatter glass. Jax didn't flinch. His voice was shaky, but it carried, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She put something in your food. I saw her. Don't eat it." Gasps rippled through the patio as every single patron swiveled towards the unfolding drama. The silence that followed was suffocating, heavy enough to choke on. Jax stood his ground, his chest heaving, adrenaline surging through him like a shot of pure lightning. Richard blinked, his gaze darting between the kid and his wife, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "What's he talking about, Bianca?" he asked, his tone deceptively calm, but his hand trembled slightly as he carefully set the spoon back down on the table. Bianca's composure, meticulously crafted and flawlessly maintained, snapped like a cheap rubber band stretched past its breaking point. She shot to her feet, her chair screeching against the stone floor, the sound amplifying the tension. "You little liar!" she hissed, venom dripping from every syllable. "How dare you accuse me of something so vile? Who even let you in here?" The words stung, laced with contempt and dismissal, but Jax didn't back down, didn't flinch. His eyes remained, locked on Richard's, desperate to break through the disbelief, to make him see the truth. "I saw her," Jax repeated, his voice gaining strength, steadying as he spoke. "She poured something into your soup when you weren't looking." He tilted his head towards the bowl, a subtle gesture. "You can smell it, if you don't believe me." Richard's face paled under his tan, the blood draining away, leaving him ashen. He turned slowly towards his wife, his eyes narrowing, the genial facade completely gone. "Bianca," he said, his voice quiet, but now edged with steel. "What's going on?" She scoffed, waving a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a bothersome fly. "He's just trying to cause trouble. Look at him," she spat, her lip curling in disgust. "He probably just wants money, or food." The words hung in the air, poisoned arrows aimed at Jax, dripping with condescension and disdain. But the kid didn't break, didn't waver. He took a step closer to the table, his fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white. "I'm not lying," he said firmly, his voice rising, cutting through Bianca's carefully constructed narrative. "She doesn't want you to know, but I saw everything." Richard's hand hovered over the bowl, torn between disbelief and the gnawing seed of doubt that was now taking root in his mind. But something in the kid's unwavering gaze, the raw honesty in his voice, made him hesitate. The air around the table seemed to thicken, the once lively patio now eerily silent. All eyes were locked on the unfolding drama, their gourmet brunches forgotten, abandoned mid-bite. Richard leaned back slightly in his chair, studying Jax with a scrutinizing gaze, the practiced stare of a man who'd seen it all, who knew every angle, every con. His face bore the etched lines of a man used to people playing games, trying to hustle him, to get a piece of his pie. But this felt different, rawer, more real. The kid didn't flinch, didn't look away, didn't try to sweet-talk. Him. "Jax," Richard said, his voice steady, though a trace of suspicion still lingered, a shadow in his eyes. The kid nodded, a jerky movement of his head. "Yes, sir. I'm telling the truth. Please, just don't eat it," he pleaded, his voice softening, almost breaking, but still insistent. Bianca let out a harsh, brittle laugh, crossing her arms, her diamond bracelet flashing like a warning sign. "This is absurd," she snapped, her tone icy, laced with contempt. "He's just some street kid looking for attention. Are you really going to entertain this nonsense, Richard?" But Richard didn't answer her. Instead, he picked up the spoon again, this time holding it closer to his face, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the quiet storm brewing inside him. "Bianca," he said slowly, deliberately, his eyes locking onto hers, holding them captive. "You heard him. What exactly is going on here?" Bianca's mask of poise cracked wider, fissures spiderwebbing across her perfect facade, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. "I can't believe you're even asking me that. It's insulting," she exclaimed, her voice rising, laced with indignation. She turned to the growing crowd, her performance ramping up. "He's lying, look at him, he probably doesn't even know who you are. Why would you trust him over me?" The weight of her words hung in the air, but they didn't land the way she'd intended. The crowd was murmuring now, a low, restless hum, their eyes darting back and forth between the three figures at table 12. Whispers, sharp and curious, floated through the air. Did she really do it? Look at her. She seems nervous. That kid doesn't look like he's making this up. The murmurs only fueled Bianca's fury, pushing her over the edge. She slammed her hands on the table, the china rattling, her polished demeanor completely shattered, revealing the raw rage underneath. "Enough of this, Richard. Eat your damn soup and let's go," she hissed, her voice trembling with uncontrolled rage. The carefully constructed veneer completely gone. But Jax wasn't backing down. He took another step forward, closing the distance, his fists clenched so tight they ached. "If you won't believe me, then call someone to test it," he shouted, his voice rising with desperate urgency. "You're rich. You've got lawyers, doctors, people who can figure it out. But don't eat it. If you do, you'll regret it." Richard's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face clenching as he turned back to the bowl. The spoon was still in his hand, but he didn't lift it to his lips. His eyes, tired and calculating, shifted back to his wife, dissecting her, peeling back the layers of artifice. "Bianca," he said, his voice low, dangerously quiet. "You've been acting strange for weeks now." Her face flushed crimson, modeling her perfect complexion, and she stumbled over her words, her carefully rehearsed script dissolving into panicked improvisation. I don't know what you're talking about. You can't seriously think I'd poison you," Richard finished for her, his tone razor-sharp, slicing through the tension. The crowd gasped audibly, their whispers swelling into a chorus of shocked disbelief. Jax stood firm, rooted to the spot, his gaze unwavering. He could feel his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but he wouldn't let it show. He'd done his part. He'd spoken his truth. Now, it was up to Richard to make the next move. Bianca straightened up, drawing herself up to her full height, her expression hardening into something cold, alien, unfamiliar. "This is ridiculous," I don't have to sit here and listen to this nonsense, she declared, grabbing her handbag, a desperate move towards escape. But before she could make a run for it, Richard's hand shot out, snaking across the table, gripping her wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. "You're not going anywhere," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Not until we get to the bottom of this." The waiter, who had been frozen in place, a silent witness to the escalating drama, finally found his voice. "Sir, should I call the police?" The question hung in the air, detonating like a small bomb, sending a ripple of shock through the patio. And for the first time, Bianca looked genuinely panicked. Real, raw terror flickered in her eyes. She shook, her head violently, her perfect hair swaying wildly. "Don't you dare! This is just a misunderstanding, Richard. You can't seriously—" But Richard raised his hand, silencing her with a sharp gesture, his gaze never leaving hers. "Yes," he said, addressing the waiter without breaking eye contact with Bianca. "Call them." Jax felt a surge of relief, a wave of adrenaline washing over him. But it was fleeting. The truth was still buried under layers of lies and denial. The tension was far from over. The patio held its collective breath, suspended in a moment of breathless anticipation as the waiter hurried inside to make the call. Richard released Bianca's wrist, but his eyes remained locked on hers, a silent battle of wills being waged across the table. The once polished charm she wore so effortlessly was now unraveling, thread by thread, replaced by a growing sense of desperation, a trapped animal's frantic energy. She glanced around, her lips moving silently, no sound coming out, like a caged bird desperately searching for an escape route. Meanwhile, Jack stood a few steps back, his hands shaking almost imperceptibly. He'd done all he could. He'd thrown the grenade. But now, he felt the icy tendrils of doubt creeping in. What if the man didn't believe him after all? What if she managed to talk her way out of this, to spin some elaborate lie and make him look like a crazy kid? He clenched his fists tighter, forcing himself to stay rooted in place, to face the consequences of his impulsive act. "Jax," Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tense silence, sharp and direct. "You said you saw her put something in the soup. Can you describe it?" The kid nodded quickly, eagerly, stepping forward, relief flooding his face. Yeah, it was a small bottle, like one you'd use for medicine, clear liquid. She poured it in when you were looking at your phone, then stirred it. I swear I saw it." Richard's face tightened, his jaw muscles working. He turned, back to Bianca, his gaze like a laser beam. She was already shaking her head, a frantic, desperate denial. "This is absurd. He's lying. Why would I—" But Richard cut her off, his voice low, dangerous. "Why would he lie, Bianca? What could he possibly gain from this?" The crowd murmured again, louder this time, the question echoing their own unspoken doubts. And the distant wail of sirens, growing steadily closer, added a soundtrack of impending doom to the charged atmosphere. Bianca's eyes darted towards the bowl of soup, a flicker of unguarded panic, a split-second glimpse behind the mask. Then, as if grasping at straws, desperate to regain control, she rounded on Jax, her anger flaring again. "You've been spying on us, haven't you? Trying to cause trouble because you're jealous of people who actually have something." The words hit Jax like a slap across the face, the casual cruelty of them cutting deeper than any physical blow. But he stood his ground, his chin lifting, his gaze unflinching. "I'm not jealous," he said firmly, his voice clear, ringing with truth. "I saw what I saw, and I couldn't just stand there and let you hurt him." The sirens grew louder, closer, until they were screaming just outside the Gilded Spoon. Two uniformed police officers, their expressions neutral, businesslike, entered the patio, the air seeming to thicken, to compress around them. Their hands rested casually on their belts, but their presence was a force field, changing everything. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his tone calm but authoritative, radiating quiet power. Richard stood, his towering frame still commanding respect, even in the face of uniformed authority, despite the shock and betrayal etched on his face. "Officers," he said, his voice steady, regaining its usual authority. "I need you to take a look at this." He gestured towards the bowl of soup on the table, the pristine white china now a focal point of suspicion. "This boy," he indicated, Jax with a nod, "claims my wife poisoned it." The officers exchanged a quick, almost imperceptible glance, their expressions carefully blank, trained to reveal nothing. One of them leaned down, sniffing the bowl cautiously, his nostrils flaring slightly. Then, he straightened up, turning to Bianca, his gaze direct and unwavering. "Ma'am, do you have anything to say about this?" Her face turned a mottled crimson, blotchy and uneven under her perfect makeup. "This is ridiculous. He's just a street kid trying to make trouble. Richard, you're really going to let this nonsense go this far?" But the officer wasn't buying her practiced deflection, her desperate attempt to regain control. "We'll need to test the contents," he stated simply, reaching for the bowl, his gloved hand extending towards the incriminating evidence. "No!" Bianca snapped, her voice rising, cracking with panic. The sudden outburst, the raw, uncontrolled emotion, drew even more attention. Every eye on the patio now riveted to her, and her sudden visceral panic only made her look exponentially guiltier. The officer paused, his eyes narrowing, studying her, his cop instincts on high alert. "Ma'am," he repeated, his voice hardening slightly, "is there something you'd like to tell us before we proceed?" Bianca hesitated, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her breath catching in her throat. She looked at Richard, her eyes pleading, desperate, then back at the officers, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. Her hands trembled visibly as she clutched her designer handbag, the expensive leather now a pathetic shield against the inevitable. Finally, her carefully constructed resolve crumbled, shattering into pieces. "Fine," she spat, her voice low, but dripping with venom, the mask completely gone, revealing the raw, ugly truth underneath. "You want the truth? Fine, you can have the damn truth. I'm tired of living in his shadow, tired of his control over everything. He was never supposed to make it past this year, and I—" She stopped abruptly, realizing too late that she'd said far too much, that the dam had broken, unleashing a torrent of incriminating words. The patio erupted in a collective gasp, a wave of shocked sound washing over them. Some patrons fumbled for their phones, their screens lighting up as they began recording the unfolding spectacle, capturing the real-life drama for posterity. Richard's face went deathly pale, the color draining away completely, leaving him looking like a ghost of his former self. The weight of her confession hit him like a physical blow, crushing the air from his lungs. The officer stepped forward, his expression grim, professional. "Ma'am," he stated, his voice clear and devoid of emotion, "I'm placing you under arrest for attempted murder. Please put your hands where I can see them." Bianca's composure shattered completely, disintegrating into raw, primal panic. She screamed, a high-pitched frantic sound, trying to wriggle free as the officers efficiently, expertly, secured her hands behind her back with zip ties. "You don't understand. I deserved everything he had. Everything!" she shrieked, her voice echoing through the stunned silence of the Gilded Spoon as they led her away, her protests fading into the distance, swallowed by the city's lunchtime roar. Richard sank back into his chair, the ornate metal cold against his back, his hand trembling violently as he pushed the bowl of poisoned soup away, as if it were radioactive. For a long moment he sat motionless, silent, staring blankly ahead, his face a mask of disbelief, of profound, gut-wrenching betrayal. Then, his eyes, slowly, deliberately, found Jax, who stood frozen a few feet away, unsure of what to do next, a mixture of fear and relief warring within him. But as Richard's gaze softened, as the shock began to recede, a flicker of something else replaced the anger, the betrayal, gratitude, pure, unadulterated gratitude. Jax hadn't just saved his life. He'd ripped away the veil of lies, exposing a truth so dark, so twisted, that Richard would have never in a million years seen coming. The Gilded Spoon, slowly, hesitantly, began to exhale. A low hum of whispers and murmurs rippled through the patio as the officers escorted Bianca out, her fading protests a macabre soundtrack to the brunch crowd's stunned recovery. Patrons exchanged wide-eyed glances, still reeling from the public unraveling they had just witnessed. Some looked at Richard with pity, a shared sense of human vulnerability. Others with morbid curiosity, the voyeuristic thrill of witnessing someone else's life explode in real time. But Jax didn't move. He stood rooted to the spot, hovering on the edge of the patio, unsure if he was supposed to stay, to disappear, to simply melt back into the anonymity of the streets. Richard turned to the kid, his face still pale, etched with shock, but his eyes now steady, focused. "Jax," he said softly, his voice carrying a weight of genuine emotion that made everyone lean in closer to hear. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit." Jax hesitated, glancing around at the lingering onlookers, the curious stares, but Richard's voice, the quiet authority in it, compelled him. Slowly, cautiously, he sank into the chair, his shoulders tense, braced for he didn't know what. "You saved my life," Richard said, his voice low, firm, each word weighted with profound meaning. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Jax fidgeted, his hands twisting together in his lap, gripping the edge of the table like a lifeline. I couldn't let it happen," he mumbled quietly, his gaze fixed on the tablecloth, avoiding Richard's intense stare. "I couldn't just watch and say nothing." Richard nodded, his gaze distant for a moment, lost in the replay of the near disaster, the terrifying realization of how close he'd come to oblivion. "Most people would have," he said after a long pause, his voice thick with emotion. "They would have turned the other way, pretended they didn't see. But you didn't. That took courage, kid." Jax shrugged, his voice barely above a whisper. "I guess I don't like seeing people get hurt. That's all." Richard leaned back, studying the kid, really seeing him for the first time. Not just as a scrappy street kid, a nameless face in the urban landscape, but as someone with a story, a soul, a core of unexpected bravery. "How long have you been out here?" Richard asked, the question catching Jax completely off guard, pulling him out of his shell of self-consciousness. He looked away, his cheeks flushing slightly, a faint tinge of embarrassment coloring his voice. "Off and on, for a while." Richard frowned, a shadow of concern crossing his face, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached into his inside pocket, pulled out a sleek obsidian black phone, the latest model, undoubtedly costing more than Jax had seen in a year. "Wait here," he said, standing and stepping a few feet away to make a call, his voice low and private. Jax watched him, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. Was he in trouble now? Was Richard going to call security? Have him hauled away for causing a scene, for interrupting his perfect brunch? But when Richard returned, his expression was calm, almost kind. "Help is on the way," he said simply, meeting Jax's questioning gaze. "Help?" Jax asked, his brow furrowing in confusion. Richard nodded, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. "I called someone I trust. They'll make sure you have a place to sleep tonight, somewhere safe. And, if you'll let me, I'd like to do more than that." The kid's eyes widened, surprise and disbelief warring in their depths. "You don't have to do that," he said quickly, instinctively, his voice defensive, wary. "I didn't do this for money or anything." Richard smiled faintly, a genuine warm smile that transformed his face, softening the hard edges of wealth and power. "I know that, Jax. That's why I want to help you. You did something most people wouldn't have. And trust me, kid, if the world had more people like you, it would be a much better place." For the first time in a long, long while, Jax felt a warmth bloom in his chest, a feeling he couldn't quite name, couldn't quite describe. He looked down, his gaze fixed on the table, unsure of what to say, overwhelmed by the unexpected turn of events. The patio patrons, slowly, cautiously, began to disperse, the immediate drama receding, but the weight of what had happened, the shockwaves of revelation, still lingering in the air. Richard picked up his glass of sparkling water, taking a long, slow sip as if savoring the simple act of being alive, of being safe. He set the glass down, the crystal clinking softly against the china, before speaking again, his voice thoughtful, quiet. "Sometimes, Jax," he said, his gaze meeting the kids. "Life gives us the chance to change someone else's story." He paused, a beat of silence hanging between them. "You changed mine today, Jax, and maybe, just maybe, I can help change yours." The boy glanced up at him, his dark eyes glistening, reflecting the sunlight, and something else, something fragile and precious that he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. As the two sat in silence, an unlikely pair, the sun continued, its arc across the sky, casting long, lengthening shadows across the patio of the Gilded Spoon. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed the midday drama. Courage doesn't always wear a power suit, and kindness doesn't always come from the wealthy. Sometimes it's the people we overlook, the ones living on the margins, who possess the greatest strength of all. In the end, Jax's bravery didn't just save a life. It reminded everyone in that upscale patio, surrounded by privilege and comfort, of the enduring power of standing up for what's right, no matter the odds, no matter the cost. If this story moved you, don't forget to smash that subscribe button and join us for more tales of courage, truth, and redemption. Share this video with someone who might need a reminder that even small actions can create life-changing impacts.